Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Green Party series. I am your host, David Rich. We have a recurring, a very special guest, Larry Spivak, on. Hello, Larry.
Hi there.
All right, Larry is the president of the Illinois Labor History Society, right?
Yes, I am.
Good. Well, welcome back to the show. I believe this is your third time on the show, which is cool.
That sounds right. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Kelvin is taking a sabbatical from the show for a little while, but labor, when he was on the show with me, labor was a very, very important issue to both of us. I think that as we expressed to you before the last two times you were on, it's just extreme, and I see it all the time. I just dealt with something concerning the free market nonsense and exploitation of labor today directly. I mean, from friends of mine, it was absurd. And I just was in my head ranting about the ridiculousness and injustice of it. So this is quite timely. Um, Okay, so why don't you give us a quick update on what's going on with the society? Anything going on? What's happening?
Well, this is a time of the year where a lot of things start happening for us because it really reflects that it's around May Day. And and I think in a lot of ways these things are connected just because people are more conscious of the holiday, which we can talk more about, which most of your viewers may or I can't assume know why May Day is an international holiday, but we can talk
I
about
think
that.
that's a safe non-assumption.
Yeah, and very important for our organization and should be for all people. But um, we are co-sponsors of a whole number of events, and for your listeners and viewers, this could be exciting and relevant. Coming up on April 28th in Marseilles, Illinois, spelled like Marseille in France, but it's Illinois, with an S at
So
the end.
Marsaille. Okay.
Yeah, there's going to be the dedication of a historical marker
Oh, neat.
from a oh my Lord, I just blanked on the date of the event, 1940, 19, oh, goodness, I just blanked on when the event took place. But
That'll
there
come back.
was a there was a this is a marker to commemorate the murder of a Joliet laborer and 21 other workers, laborers who were 300 who marched to protest when there was a building of a federal dam in Marseilles, Illinois, along the Illinois River there, and uh, this of out of state workers were hired at substandard wages. So 300 workers from the laborers in Joliet marched, and literally a war broke out, and 21 workers were injured, and a fellow by the name of Big Steve Sutton was murdered. And what's exciting about this commemoration and this historical marker, aside from the fact that it's Worker Memorial Day, which is one of the holidays for workers in this country and certainly in Illinois, is that Tom Morello, who is
Yeah,
from Marseilles, Rage Against the Machine. I assume this, you probably more of your listeners know who Tom Morello is than why May Day is a holiday.
100%.
Um, and he'll be performing.
Oh,
Yeah, he
that's
wrote a
cool.
song. He wrote a song about this event, so he'll be there in Marseilles. It's going to be in our newsletter, and I thinking the time is 4:30. Bear with me. I don't have the note in front of me when it actually begins. It's late in the afternoon. I think it's 4:30, and it's but it people won't have problems finding it if they want to look it up. And so that'll be taking place. Also, Bucky Hawker, probably I consider the country's premier labor troubadour, who has been on our board of Labor History Society. He's a singer-songwriter. He's written many labor songs, performs all over the state and all over the country, and actually all over the world. Will be performing along with Tom Morello. Um, and the coming up, of course, is May 1st, and there's several events. One is in Mount Olive, Illinois. Now, if you have savvy uh, listeners about labor history, that is, they're all savvy, they'll know that that is where the great Mother Jones is buried in Mount Olive, the Union Miners Cemetery. There's
The
always
Mother Jones.
and May 1st is the her birthday, and so there's going to be a festival there, and with speakers and music and various other events. That's just about, I think it's about 20 miles this side of the Mississippi River from St. Louis. So it's in Illinois, Mount Olive, one of the last stops before St. Louis off of I-55. And it's a union-owned cemetery. And Mother Jones was buried there after she died in 1930. She wanted to be buried with her minor angels because of an important strike that took place in 1909 and 1898 rather, in Verdun, Illinois, which is a coal miner strike. A lot of people may not know that Springfield, Illinois was the second biggest coal mining state in the country. And just south of Springfield, Illinois, was a massacre again of workers when strike breakers were brought in, and the miners in Verdun were being scabbed, and several miners were shot to death. And Mother Jones, who traveled all around the United States, who is she was considered the most dangerous woman in America at that time by that's how the papers and the judiciary coined a term for her. She said that when she died, she wanted to be buried with her minor angels, the boys of Verdun, because as we know, there were boys who worked in the mines, and she recognized that they couldn't be buried in Verdun because it was prohibited because they were part of the strike. And so the miners built a cemetery, and that's where they're buried and she's buried. Actually, quite an exciting place to visit. Cemeteries are the place, considering Haymarket, Mother Jones, and others. Also on May 1st, which of course is a premier event for us, is the May Day event plaque dedication in Haymarket Square, which is at Displays in Randolph in Chicago, just west of the Loop. And every year since 2005, we've had a May Day celebration there, and it is to commemorate, of course, International Labor Day, which are the events from the Haymarket affair, the Haymarket tragedy, that gave rise to the holiday that's celebrated probably by more people as a secular holiday other than New Year's Eve than any holiday in the world, May Day, except here in the United States. Right. And we have a plaque being dedicated from an Italian labor federation. Every year, an international labor federation comes to Haymarket, or a labor federation. Last year was the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and they dedicate a plaque to the sculpture monument in Haymarket Square. There will also be stuff going on all day on May 1st in Forest Home Cemetery, where the Haymarket martyrs are buried. Forest Park's just west of Chicago, next Oak Park, and that is what we are deed holders of. We own the Haymarket Martyrs Monument and are caretakers, stewards of that, along with Emma Goldman's awesome gravesite. So, and then that afternoon will be Mother Jones' birthday party at the Irish American Heritage Center on the north side, and that's at 4621 Knox. I'll continue on May. This is a lot, but these are things that people can go if they care about history. I mean, if they care about the future, really, that's what this is about. Then they should attend these things. And Pullman, in Pullman, which is on the south side of Chicago, 111th in Cottage Grove, the town of Pullman, which it once was, where the palace cars by George Pullman were built, but created the great 1894 Pullman strike. Yep. And of course, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters emerged from that whole era. Ultimately, there's going to be railroad days, and there's going to be a photo exhibit honoring the workers of Pullman from way back when. And there's going to be historic vintage Pullman cars at the metro station that comes right up to it. There's going to be labor tours that we'll conduct, and that's on May 14th in Pullman. But like Ginsu knives, there's more. Yes, there is more.
Just when you thought that was all, there's more.
Yeah. I didn't mention. I didn't mention on May 4th is we've helped create an organization called the U.S. Canada Labor History Network, and we've
Nice.
been doing these forums. And on May 4th, we're going to be doing it's going to be a Zoom discussion about with a couple of academics and those of us from different labor history societies talking about the 8-hour day and the issue of work and how relevant is the 8-hour day in the present. Again, of course, those who don't know the history, May Day is about the fight for the 8-hour day, and that's really how the events of Haymarket came about. But that's a longer story. On
Can I
May
ask you one
13th,
thing real quick?
sure.
Okay, just because Ginny Lester, hello Ginny, is asking. She's asking for the date for the Messiah event one more time.
April 28th, if I didn't mention it,
April
April
28th. Okay.
28th. Yeah.
All right. Thanks,
And
Ginny.
then, and I know these are a lot of things, but this is the story of labor. So it's
Yeah,
another way
no.
to talk about it. On May 13th, as the opening into July at the Yuri Eichen Gallery at 2100 South Halsted, it's going to be a retrospective of the work of Mark Rogovin. He was really the caretaker of the Haymarket Summit Martyrs Monument for us. He wrote the book, The Day Will Come, about, with all the biographies of the Haymarket martyrs that are in the cemetery. Mark passed away 2.5 years ago, but he founded the Peace Museum, and his father was a well-known photographer, Milton Rogovin, whose work Mark managed, but Mark in his own right was a muralist and a painter and an artist. And so this retrospective of his work will be at the gallery. And then on May 16th, we are sponsoring a book talk by an author, a professor from Toronto. Her name is Jenny Carson, and the name of the book is Black Women Laundry Workers, Justice and Fight for Justice. And that's going to be at the Gage Gallery at Roosevelt University at 425 South Wabash, which is in downtown Chicago. And then the other event, which is one of the huge historical Illinois, Chicago events, is the Republic Steel Massacre commemoration of 1937. The May Day, they call it the Memorial Day Massacre of 1937, where 11 workers were shot in the back and killed by the police while they were peacefully picketing. And it's at the Steelworkers Hall at 11731 South Avenue O in Chicago. And there is a great sculpture there too, commemorating the Memorial Day Massacre. So there are all these events which in some ways mostly commemorate acts of injustice and tragedy, but also gave rise to social change.
Yes, absolutely. That's a lot. That's very cool.
Mm-hmm.
That's very, very cool.
Yeah.
All right. If anybody has any more questions, just go ahead and put them in the comment section right there. Otherwise, can you find all or most of this or some of this on the website, the Illinois Labor History?
It's just popping up on our website right now. There'll be updates to it, but yeah, go to illinoislaborhistory.org to our website, and hopefully all the details will be there.
Okay, very cool. There's a series of questions in the private chat area here, and I guess we can talk. We can just go in order, I suppose. Can you give us like a brief, account of like the evolution of the labor movement in Illinois? I
I
know
laugh because it's like, where do you start?
no, I know exactly. That's where my mind went too. Like, I mean, I guess what a lot of people do, I think don't realize is the importance of the labor movement and how it defines so many of the
Yeah,
healthy regulations and parameters we have now concerning labor, including the fact that your kid doesn't have to go to work, so which is a big deal.
right.
Um, but that a lot of it happened here in Illinois and the Chicagoland area. Now it was all over the country and all over the world, in fact. But I mean, as far as talking about American labor movement, a lot of it happened here. The Haymarket Affair, like you mentioned a couple times here, was a pivotal moment in the labor movement and the fight for social
Yeah.
justice in general. Um, Absolutely. So yeah, go ahead if you can like find an arbitrary starting point. Like if you want to start
Well,
with the Haymarket Affair and go on from there.
no, well, actually, it's worth starting before that.
Okay.
But I think the significant event, yeah, actually, a lot of viewers may not be aware of this, but the Chicago fire is actually a significant precursor to what a lot of this, because
Okay.
in 1871, the Chicago fire was more, what happened after was really pivotal. And part of it was that there were the money that was raised for uh, through charities, millions of dollars, I believe it was $5 to $6 million, was basically taken by corporations as interest-free loans rather than giving back to the people of Chicago who needed it. This outraged people who at that time were active, many who were in the fledgling labor movement of that time, people like Albert Parsons
Yeah.
and Lucy Parsons, two
Mhm.
very important figures in our history. Lucy Parsons, I would argue, is one of the most important people in American history
That nobody knows.
that nobody knows about. And Albert, her husband, who was the key labor leader of the time, but at that time he was an activist, a writer of many sorts, and um, many sorts. I mean, he had his hands in many areas of activism. Uh, and he and others were protesting this idea that corporate America would be taking this money from the needs of the people. And I often say that, this is something that we talk about today, but goes back to that period leading into the Gilded Age. And this is a period of time when there were all these boom and bust cycles of the early capitalism, industrialization of the United States, and Chicago being the fastest growing city in the country, where, within, you know, I mean, I can't remember the exact figures of how fast Chicago grew, but by 1886, well, there were already 1 million people living in the city. People from all around the world were flocking to come to Chicago to the new industries that were being built. And in 1877, and I think we talked about this in a previous interview, the Great Upheaval, it's often called the Great Upheaval, closest thing to a revolution for workers this country ever had, was a national railroad strike. It started in West Virginia and spread across the country in 1877. And by July, had come to Chicago, and workers all across the country were not just railroad workers, but were just in sympathy walking out. And this gave rise to the need of the corporate elite, the owners and captains of industry, to protect themselves, because they were worried that ultimately this would, when they saw what happened in Chicago, called the Battle of the Viaduct, where 10,000 people were protesting and up to 30 to 40 workers were killed by the militias, the private armies and the militias and the police and the national. And then, of course, the very wealthy saw this protesting as a way to uh, um, be a way to arm themselves. So they created National Guards and more private militias, and ultimately you have, and the state, of course, to defend the ruling class. And because workers were becoming conscious, as railroads being the largest industry of the time, were spreading their ideas because of the railroads across the country, and the unfairness, the exploitation, the inability to actually make a living wage. So that is probably what I always think of as the seminal event that gave rise to, was built upon in terms of worker consciousness, working class struggle in Illinois and in the country in many ways. And that leads to the call for even though there were calls for an 8-hour day, and there was even legislation that was never enforced at the federal level, in 1884, the call for the 8-hour day, that all workers should be on strike in the country by May 1st of 1886. And it was at May 4th, 1886, after a peaceful protest of May 1st in Chicago of 80,000 people, that police came and shot and killed two workers at the McCormick Reaper plant. And that's when the protest meeting was called at Haymarket Square, which gave rise to a bomb that was thrown that nobody knows who threw it, that resulted in the hanging of ultimately four men. One died in prison and three spent time in jail before they were pardoned by Governor Altgeld in 1893. And so if I continue on the timeline, if you want me to, we then go to the Pullman strike of 1894. But I could go on and on about these events. The Pullman strike was important because it really gives rise to the idea of organizing on an industrial basis instead of just a work sector basis or a craft basis within a factory where you might have 10, 12, 20 unions in a factory. The idea was organize all steel workers into steel, all ironwork, all whatever industry it was, all coal miners into one union, all railroad workers into one union. And ultimately, in 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, are formed in Chicago, once again in Illinois, the idea of one big union for all workers. You have the stockyards are organizing at that time, and the big fire of 1904 in Chicago at the stockyards gives rise to Upton Sinclair's book, the Jungle, which raises the whole consciousness about working conditions. And Mother Jones is in and out of Illinois organizing. She was actually Lucy Parsons' Mother Jones were there at the founding of the IWW. You have the Settlement House and Hull House with Jane Addams teaching women how to organize, which is never explained well who Jane Addams was. We talk about her as the mother of social work. She was a fighter for the working class. She was involved in strikes and very influenced by them. So this is all, leading up to the turn of the century and just after. And of course, I'm just going to quickly, since you asked kind of for a timeline, going into, by 1919, you have the race riots in Chicago, actually across the country, but very big in Illinois. And some of it's connected to the organizing of the stockyard workers, a strike that fails in 1920, but teaches the workers that until you have unity, racial unity, you cannot organize a place. That is, you couldn't organize them before when ethnic groups were fighting each other. But once it became about white, black, the idea that you could only organize when you have unity. And that's the story, really, of any successful action is unity. Any successful strike is based on people together. Fred Redmond, who is the current vice president of the AFL, he's the new vice president of the AFL-CIO, comes out of the steelworkers in Chicago. He talks about how the only first time he ever got called brother was when he joined the union. When it was, think about being black in America. You were never anybody's brother unless it was just among African Americans. But in the union, the tradition was, despite internal conflicts and segregation and all the things that every institution has, the union was a place in many places across the country, even in the South, where if you were in the union, you were a brother. And so the packing house workers organizing of the 1930s, I mentioned, of course, one of the most important events was the organizing of the first Black American Union, the African American Union of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who came out of Pullman, who couldn't be part of the white unions. And in 1937 got their first contract and became, there's a great book by Larry Ty called Rising from the Rails, the building of the Black middle class. It's about the Pullman porters who took care of people on those Pullman train cars. So this is even all before World War II. I could, more recently, of course, from the Chicago Teachers Union strikes of the last decade, which are significant across the country and helping other workers think about things, about how things could be better for teachers. In between, there is no shortage of other events, and I've talked a long time about it just barely scratching the surface.
Sure, sure. No, that was great. I mean, do you have a degree in labor history?
Not at all.
Okay, you have a wonderful memory of the nuances, as if you're just like highly trained in it.
Well,
Which
I'm trained because I care. That's all.
no,
If you
that's
care about
which
something,
is even more impressive.
yeah, no, I have I have a teaching. I got a degree in education. Um,
Okay,
my
which
first
teaches you how to
teaching
learn. Yeah.
my first teaching job was third graders.
Well, that's cute.
That
Actually,
that was the hardest job I ever had in my
I can
life. I couldn't do
absolutely.
it.
I'm sure it is. No, no,
So
no.
anyway, most of my adult life, I worked for the American Federation of State County Municipal Employees, a union. I was regional director when I retired in 2017 from there. But the story of history, labor history, captured my imagination because it's the story of America.
Yep.
The story of Pullman is the story of America.
Yep.
Race, class, gender, capital, labor, everything, the economy, you could talk about immigration, and this happens time because it's about work and that's what we do, right? Most of us do.
It really strikes a very fundamental aspect of the human condition, the human identity, is that we labor. People alter their environment by nature. That's what we do. We construct things, we build things, we take things down and replace them. We labor. We do. It's a massively important part of who we are as an entity. All right, very cool. So then another question is, what was the most successful strike in Illinois? I'm guessing successful meaning the laborers
Hmm.
got what they demanded,
Well,
or the
it's
top five
here.
if you
Here's an interesting. So these questions have relative answers, or I think that's a way to put it. But um, I mean, the the Haymarket tragedy is a strike across the country. Think about this:
okay.
350,000 workers are on strike for the 8-hour day. One-fourth of them are in Chicago.
Wow.
And before May 1st of 1886, 10,000 workers already won the 8-hour day because of their strikes and their marches and their protests. Um, May, the events of Haymarket, where the men are martyred, in 1889 gives rise to the call across the world in a Congress in Paris, France in 1889 to commemorate May 1st as International Labor Day in honor of the Haymarket martyrs. How more successful can you be that billions of people have celebrated International Labor Day because of the strikes for the 8-hour day?
There you
So
go.
that's one take on it. Another take on it, I already talked about. Why Pullman? Well, because there already was this push across the world and in the United States for May Day, the government and industry was very concerned after the Pullman strike of 1894, and which is a wonderful historic story about how that happens and what takes place. But that summer, that September, the strike is crushed by the federal government and corporate America because they threw all the leaders in jail by using antitrust laws that were supposed to be used against monopoly capital, against the labor union, the American Railway Workers Union. They threw the leaders in jail. Eugene Debs, who ultimately ran for president as a convict in federal prison and got over 1 million votes on the Socialist Party
Yeah, no,
ticket.
yeah, he's an amazing
Yeah,
story, for sure.
that strike ultimately results in the creation of American Labor Day. So we got a holiday the first Monday in September
Right.
to kind of appease the working class. That's certainly one take on it. So now we have international holidays and national holidays because of these strikes.
No, I mean, those
Yeah,
grandiose effects are
yeah,
definitely attributable to a successful strike or a successful
yeah,
moment in labor history.
yeah.
Real quick, Ginny Lester, I'm sorry, is saying, I am an IWW delegate. Contact me if you want more information on how to join. Okay, so it's GINI space
Hmm.
LESTER is her name, and just I guess type in her name and IWW delegate. You should Google will probably get you there somehow. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Larry.
I'm going to jump forward because I do think that a couple other, when we talk about history, I think that, in some ways people could say I say it's relative because, these strikes didn't initially result in, oh, we got a contract and we got these benefits. Strikes that result in a collective bargaining agreement are probably less significant than strikes that created social change, like Haymarket, like um, Pullman, like the organizing of the packing house workers, the steel workers, because some of these strikes were national too. In terms of getting the first, the Memorial Day Massacre of 1937, that strike for organizing Little Steel, not U.S. Steel, which had just gotten a contract with John L. Lewis as president of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, by the way, who is buried in Springfield, Illinois. He's from Iowa, but a lot of people don't know that. He's buried very close to Abraham Lincoln, at least within a city block in that cemetery. And um, uh, uh, so what are the packing house workers, striking for recognition and organizing? Sometimes when we say strike, let's talk about just organizing, which includes strikes within strikes. Create the idea of creating a multi-ethnic and multiracial coalition. The organizing Little Steel in 1937 was a year the Pullman Porters didn't strike, but they fought for 12 years under the leadership of A. Philip Randolph to create that union that gave rise to the entire middle, it built a middle class in many ways for Black workers. And the other thing, and this is why, I'm talk about what's successful. A. Philip Randolph and the Pullman Porters created the foundation in many ways for the civil rights movement in this country. People don't realize that the relationship of labor to civil rights, and Martin Luther King didn't organize the March on Washington. A. Philip Randolph and others called for the March on Washington in 1963, the march, which wasn't a march to end segregation or civil rights. It was a march for jobs and it was a march for jobs and to end poverty. That's what it was a call for. And but Martin Luther King learned from A. Philip Randolph, who called for a boycott, a national march on Washington in 1942 to end desegregation of the defense industry. This is the labor leader, A. Philip Randolph of the Pullman Porters. And President Roosevelt signed the executive order ending segregation of the defense plants and the federal government under the federal government in the 1940s. So these are huge social change events that come out of the working class, of strikes and the building of class consciousness. And so that is of course, I'm just talking about Illinois, but it has a national, international effect. And so I don't know if that directly answers the question, but I think
No,
it
it's a
gets to the heart.
perfect
Yeah.
answer. Yeah, no, for sure.
Hmm.
I mean, I mean, there's probably like you're saying, if you think of it this way, there are a lot of different ways you can approach that
Yeah,
question.
I do think that the teacher union strikes from 2013, I think it was, in the recent one, are significant. And there was a reason that a few years back across the country, teachers from around in states that weren't even where they didn't even have legal collective bargaining, like West Virginia and Arizona and so on, all walked out of their jobs in order for wage increases. And we have seen in the last year and going forward now, through this period of the pandemic, this consciousness raising of we can't, live without organizing. And suddenly, Starbucks all across the country are organizing, and there's of course, certainly efforts to organize Amazon workers, which are were crushed by the corporate by Jeff Bezos,
Yeah.
And so the biggest obstacle to organizing in this country, of course, is overcoming employer animus, the ability of the using the government and the anti-labor laws that exist in this country that don't exist in the same way in any other developed country. So a lot of people are like, well, why don't more people belong to unions? Well, you're most likely to get fired if you in the private sector if you try to organize a union because you can be fired even though it's illegal. And so people are afraid, but that fear is being overcome. And that's this, unfortunately, that's the country we currently live in. But again, history tells us that people have overcome great odds and but it's not always in one day.
Very
It takes
rarely
time.
is it, if ever.
Yeah.
No, it takes a long time. And I'm going to ask one more question off this little thing here, but I would like to talk about the what you see as the future of the labor movement and unions before we end the show. Um, let's see here. Were there any key elements that led up to strikes? Yeah, labor oppression. Okay, let's go to the next one. Any notable strikes and what kind of support was available? Any notable strikes and what kind of support? I think that means like outside of like the labor movement, what were like unexpected characters that involve themselves in the movements. Any rich people go down there like, you know what, you're right, labor is really important. Let me help you.
I got a funny story.
Okay, good.
So it's not, I don't know if it's funny, but I thought it was interesting. This is what was the year that our governor, Jay Pritzker, was running
2000,
for governor?
well, 2019.
2018, 19.
18? No,
Let's
it's only
see.
been in 2 years, I think.
Yeah. So the year that he was elected, before he was governor, he showed up at our May Day rally at Haymarket Square. I thought that was kind of interesting.
A
We don't
billionaire.
let, yeah. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting, and because he was courting labor at that time, but of all places to come, right? And just an anecdote to say the least. But um, uh, in terms of, if I understood the question, uh, you know, politicians, Democratic politicians always give lip service to not all Democratic politicians, but when there's a key strike, we'll show up at rallies from time to time. But the last couple of, I'm trying to think of the last couple of big strikes. The strike at Mondelez had a lot of support. From people all over. Those are, of course, the Oreo cookie people. Mondelez is the corporation. Um, uh, um, I don't know what else to say, but solidarity is key, and there's a potential for some big strikes coming up across the country, like UPS. But I think as important as the strikes are, the bigger question is how do we get workers who are only 6% of the private sector workforce is even in a union, 35, 38% in the public sector. But how do we get the country back to where there is the days when 1 out of 3 workers were in a union in the 1960s, early 60s, and before really the late 50s, when you had that many people in a union, you represented everybody.
Right.
And it's kind of what happens in the public sector now, because in the public sector, unions drive the wages and working conditions, because even though not everybody's in the union, you have almost 40% of the workforce unionized. And so that's why the public sector from the 1980s, mid 80s to the present has become, the sort of the um, place where you have better wages and benefits, and where it's declined for 40 years in the private sector because of the attack to get rid of unions from across the country. So it's really a question of getting the average American, I think, your family, our neighbors, to be there to start saying, yeah, we all need a union. And, the recent polling, even the big polling like Gallup, last poll showed 68% of the public, of the general public, supports the idea of union, are favorable to unions. This
Yeah,
is the
no,
first,
it's I think
this
it's
in
higher.
50 years. This is now up from 50 years ago.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, just I mean, I don't I my personal experience is statistically irrelevant, but I mean, I was just talking to a lot of people. I know a friend of mine who is, just for an example, he's a Trump loving Republican. He thinks everything should be unionized. I'm like, okay, and
Mhm.
it's just the unexpected people you think actually do
Yeah,
agree with it in a lot of ways.
yeah.
Um,
You
okay,
know, I always love to talk about the fact that the people who are 100% union are the richest and the most talented. Think about it. What all our professional athletes are unionized and they have agents.
true. That's very true. Yeah, that's
Right. There,
remember the
you
baseball
just,
stuff in the late '90s.
if you watch the Academy Awards, I mean, who's more talented than the actors and actresses? They didn't get there because of luck. I mean, of course, there's always luck, but in sports and in these performance arts, and it's about talent. And there was always the problem with unions is that it creates mediocrity. Well, it's just the opposite. The rich and the powerful understand the need for a union. It's the average worker who has been taught the lie that they don't need a union. That's the irony of it all.
Yeah, no, you're right, exactly. That's the paradox, the twist. Um, okay, so this is kind of an interesting question. I think, were there Southern or Central Illinois strikes, meaning like farmers, rural strikes?
Well,
I
in
mean,
the
most
coal mine,
farms are family owned, and like I don't think
yeah.
like did the kids like try to overthrow their parents, that kind of
Well, there was in the 1930s, there was the um, uh, Tenant Farmers Union, which tried to organize farmers from across the country, but mostly in the South and in the Southwest. I don't know to what degree it occurred in Illinois. Obviously, there are cooperatives, and not in Illinois, but at the turn of the century, you had the Grange, and you had if you look at the party in Minnesota, the DFL, the Democratic Farm Labor Party. Um, uh, the populist organizing among farmers in the turn of the century was all across the Midwest. But into the present, it's not that. That's certainly not the case. But the the Tenant Farmers Union, I just blanked on the actual, it's the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. I suddenly can't remember. We're organizing all around to try to create a strike for farmers and small farmers. Today, most farms are agribusiness.
Right.
So, but in Illinois, in rural Illinois, all the coal mines all throughout southern Illinois, Centralia, and from mine disasters to we had you just go 80 miles west of Chicago, Cherry, Illinois. You have a great monument there of the coal miners. Those were all rural people, and from the 1909 strike. Um, Actually, an interesting little town to visit where 260 Italian immigrants, primarily who lived in Cherry, Illinois, were miners, perished, many of them very young. The second largest coal mining disaster in the country
Oh, really?
in 1909, Cherry, Illinois. Yeah, we participated in 2009 in a celebration there and the dedication of a monument. So the coal miners were many of them were country rural people just like they are today in Appalachia. So, but in terms of farmers, I don't know how to answer that other than the Tenant Farmers Union organizing and the Grange and the populist and farm worker movements of the turn of the century.
Sorry, I'm trying to look up Cherry, Illinois. I want to see how far away it is.
I think it's 85 miles.
Okay, I got it. 2 hours and 20 minutes from my house. That's not bad. No, because I mean that would be really interesting for me growing up in an Italian family and loving the labor movement.
There are still a couple Italian restaurants there.
Well, good. I'm going to need
These
some.
little rural, it's this kind of world that we don't even think about. But
Oh
yeah,
wow,
go there. There's
maybe
a
I'll go there.
museum. Yeah,
Cherry, Illinois. That's great. Thank you.
yeah.
This is why I love having.
Actually,
Oh,
yeah, actually, Italian immigrants played a big role in mining in Illinois, certainly other states, but the same in Springfield. You had a large Italian immigrant population in Springfield because of coal mining.
that's fantastic. I think we forget now, and I don't know. Obviously, I can't speak for people in the long ago past, but that everything now came from somewhere. I think there's some sort of detachment from history. Like we think of it as some sort of unrealistic thing. Some like because like our lifestyles are so different now than they were even 70 years ago with advancements in technology and that kind of thing, if you call them that. Just the way I mean, with color TV versus black and white, we see the world differently. I think, and I think we definitely forget that everything we have came from like people fighting for it, and we should I think be a lot more grateful for that and pay a lot more attention to these heroes of the past. But you brought up the good segue to what's the future of the labor movement look like to you?
Hmm.
Well, there's a difference
Well,
between like describing the future and prescribing the future. How do you think it should be? Let's go with that.
oh, well, how should it be? I mean, let's go back to the utopian socialists of the 19th century. Yeah, I mean, of course, that was the ideal of certainly from the writing of Capital to um, the from to the Communist Manifesto to the anarchist movements and the anarcho-syndicalists and the trade unionists and many philosophical ideas after the beginning of industrialization, and the idea that industrialization was a bridge to a more and is uh, to a more progressive ideal of living. When around that time of Haymarket was the famous slogan, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for what we will. The idea that 8 of those hours that we weren't working or sleeping would be dedicated to whatever we wanted it to be. And the idea that industrialization would bring more free time ultimately was bringing more degradation, alienation from labor, because you no longer made the things and sold the things that you made, but you made a little piece of something on an assembly line and had no connection to it. And so these philosophical notions of a better life grew out of this degradation and this and the poverty that ensued from it, instead of wealth that immigrants thought they were going to come to in this country. And certainly, uh, so the ideal is that we won't need to work for money. That we'll just be able to just work well. And slogans of that era: from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. An injury to one is an injury to all. Go on and on. The idea that it's really about a collective. In this day and age, we use the term, and then earlier, 20 years ago, it takes a village. These ideas that the American democracy really can only be realized if everybody has a chance. We have competing views on that. We have the view that you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which, by the way, was the name of the book written by the president of Republic Steel, who massacred the 11 workers at
Oh,
Republic Steel in Chicago. He wrote a book called Bootstraps. He hated unions, and he said, I rose up by pulling myself up from my bootstraps. And I think that's where the term may have come from.
I mean,
It may have predated that, but he used it as his autobiography. And lo and behold, we tend to know that the very, very wealthy had never pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They
nobody
basically
does.
inherit their money. If you look at Bezos was given 300 something $1,000 to start his business. Let's talk. We could go on and on. I don't want
Not
to
to mention
then.
the fact that they didn't do it literally by themselves. I mean, they had
Of
other
course,
they had
yeah,
to
and as
secure and
and as
refer
we
them.
all know, they're the ones that got the PPE loans, and they're the ones that use this TIF districts and they get the subsidization, and they can't exist without our tax dollars. So, but having said that, I think the question is, well, what would I envision? I would envision that there would be a more equitable distribution of wealth. Wealth inequality is what, in so many ways, I mean, that goes back to because the roots are in slavery and, discrimination and the poverty that continues generation after generation because of those institutionalized institutionalized inequality, if you will. And so, whether we use legislation and organizing to end that and to create a society where we only have to work part time because there's enough money, there's enough wealth, there's enough resources. It's how you articulate it, it's how you distribute it. And when 400 people own the wealth of, I guess actually less, but there's different statistics that go around, that there are 400 people who have the wealth of 50% of the entire world.
It's unbelievable.
Okay. So,
I mean, it's ridiculous.
I don't want to talk about Ukraine and Russia, but the reason I mention it is that they talked about the guy's yacht, the oligarch, who's $700 million yacht.
Yeah, it has a discotheque that turns into a swimming pool.
Right, $700 million.
Yeah, it's stuck.
We can't even
in Italy right now.
Yeah. It's so. But ultimately, it's a question for workers and workers being organized, because in this country, history proved that when workers organized after during the New Deal and then beyond, wealth inequality reduced greatly. Most of the wealth that started getting created came to the building of a middle class because of their organizing into unions and the negotiations of unions for all workers. So I would say the ability to organize workers is the number one fundamental change agent for the end of inequality in this country, or ending or alleviating inequality. And that's what I think was envisioned by the idealists of the 19th century, and even times before and times after.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I know Marx was attributed as having kind of like brought a lot of the differing, centralizing the socialist ideal into an economic system known as Marxism. Real quick, Albert is watching. Hello, Albert. He's asking any book suggestions on labor history.
Oh gosh, I like to suggest the book just to understand kind of a general survey. It was written easily 10 years ago, but it's a recent book in the scheme of things, called There Is Power in the Union by Philip Dray. There's Power in the Union. To understand Haymarket, the best book, the recently deceased James Green, Death in the Haymarket. Those are two I like to talk about. I think if you want to read the autobiography of Mother Jones by Elliot Gorn, Gorn, is the best biography on her. It's those are three that I would seek out, and you can go to our website and look for them and buy them from us as well. A little commercial there, IllinoisLaborHistory.org. We do run a bookstore, and we sell books, and we'd rather have you buy them from us than Jeff Bezos. So.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, we got like literally 1 minute left. Thank you, everybody, for commenting and asking questions. That's great. Larry, I always love having you on the show. I learned so much. I mean, seriously, I think I'm going to go to Cherry, Illinois next weekend. That's very cool. Any last things you want to go ahead and plug those events before we end? You have more than 1 minute.
It was a lot of plugging of events. I just say go to our website, check these things out. Come if you're in the Chicago area, come to certainly to May Day again this year, and meet our friends from Italy who are dedicating a plaque. And look at the plaque, and go to Haymarket Square, and go to Haymarket, and go to Pullman, which is now a national park, and see what's happening there in the new visitor center that we have also been part of, and support the Illinois Labor History Society. We just sent out our renewals, and we're doing a monument fund to continue to support the world's most important sacred labor site, the Haymarket Martyrs Monument in Forest Park. We are always doing upkeep, and those are, and I've mentioned all these other events. And the other thing is, when you hear there's a strike, go to a picket line. When you, I actually don't know if the IBW settled at yeah, I think they did at WTTW recently. But try to understand history a little bit better. And ultimately, it's about the question. I always say it's about the questions one asks and why it is that we aren't taught the things that really have changed history in so many ways. And when you understand why you haven't learned who Mother Jones is, why you haven't learned who Lucy Parsons is, why you don't know who August Spies is, why you don't know who John L. Lewis is, why you don't know that A. Philip Randolph was the founder of the civil rights movement, and why you don't know that Jane Addams was really a labor activist. When you find out that the reasons for this have to do with understanding where power comes from, you'll feel more power yourself. So knowing one's own history is powerful. That's why everybody does ancestry and all that, right? So
right. I know it is very powerful. Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. All right, very cool. I'd like to stick around for after when the show ends, Larry. I want to see if I can get you back on another date. Thank you everybody for tuning into the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host David Rich. Till next time, be good, be green.